Garrett never expected that one ordinary Tuesday at the park would change everything. When he snapped a candid photo of his 6-year-old son Jake playing with an elderly stranger on the swings, he thought he was just capturing a sweet moment. But when that photo ended up on the evening news 3 days later, it unraveled a mystery that had haunted a family for decades. Sometimes the most powerful connections happen between strangers. Sometimes a single photograph can bridge the gap between loss and hope. Sometimes the stories we think we know are just the beginning. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds in golden slats, catching the dust motes that danced above Jake's cereal bowl. Garrett watched his 6-year-old son methodically fish out each piece of marshmallow from his Lucky Charms, arranging them in a perfect rainbow arc around the rim of the bowl. "Dad, why do grown-ups always walk so fast?" Garrett paused, coffee mug halfway to his lips. Jake's questions always came from nowhere, like small lightning strikes in the ordinary morning routine. "What do you mean, buddy?" "At the park yesterday. That lady with the dog was walking really fast, and the man with the newspaper, and everyone. But there was this old man on the bench who wasn't walking fast at all. He was just sitting." Garrett set down his mug. 3 months since the divorce papers were signed, and Jake still noticed everything, every detail that suggested the world might not be as steady as it once seemed. Maybe some people have places to be, and maybe some people are exactly where they need to be. Jake considered this, poking at a purple horseshoe with his spoon. "Can we go to the park again today?" "After school, yeah, if you want." "I want." The simplicity of it, the wanting, the asking, the easy yes still, caught Garrett off guard. For 2 years, every decision had been negotiated through lawyers and custody schedules and the careful choreography of a marriage falling apart. Now it was just the two of them, and sometimes the quiet felt too big, sometimes it felt just right. Riverside Park at 4:30 on a Tuesday had the sleepy quality of a place waiting for something to happen. The playground equipment stood empty, except for a lone swing moving slightly in the breeze, and the basketball court held only the echo of sneakers from an earlier game. Garrett found their usual bench close enough to watch Jake, but far enough to let him explore. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through work emails he'd been avoiding since lunch. The accounting firm where he worked had been understanding about the custody arrangements, but understanding had limits, and Garrett could feel those limits approaching like a distant storm. Dad, look!" Jake had discovered something near the old oak tree that dominated the far corner of the park. Garrett looked up to see his son crouched down, examining what appeared to be a small pile of acorns arranged in a careful pattern. "Someone made a heart," Jake called out, his voice bright with discovery. Garrett pocketed his phone and walked over. The acorns were indeed arranged in a perfect heart shape, each one placed with deliberate care. "That's pretty cool. Wonder who made it." "Maybe the squirrels," Jake said seriously. "Maybe they're romantic." The laugh that escaped Garrett felt rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a while. Jake grinned up at him, gap-toothed and proud of his joke. "Come on, let's see if the swings are free." They walked toward the playground, Jake skipping ahead, when Garrett noticed the old man sitting on the bench near the swings. He was exactly as Jake had described, completely, still in a world of constant motion, hands folded in his lap, watching the empty playground with patient attention. Jake stopped skipping. "That's him," he whispered, though they were still 20 feet away. "The man who wasn't walking fast." Garrett felt that familiar tug of parental protection, the instinct to steer his son away from strangers, especially ones who spent their afternoons alone in parks. But something about the man's posture, the gentle way he sat with his shoulders slightly curved, suggested sadness rather than danger. "Just stay close, okay?" Jake nodded and ran toward the swings. The old man looked up as they approached, and Garrett saw kind eyes set in a face mapped with deep lines. He was probably in his 70s, wearing a cardigan despite the warm October afternoon, and when he smiled at Jake, the expression transformed his entire face. "Those are good swings?" the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent Garrett couldn't place. I used to push my grandson on swings just like those. Jake climbed onto the nearest swing, gripping the chains with determination. Can you push me really high? He asked Garrett. Start easy, buddy. Work your way up. Garrett gave Jake a gentle push, then another, watching as his son pumped his legs with fierce concentration. The old man watched too, and Garrett found himself studying the stranger's expression. There was something wistful there, something that spoke of memory and loss. He's got good form, the old man said quietly. Thanks, he's been working on it. They stood in comfortable silence as Jake gained momentum, his hair flying back with each forward swing. The afternoon sun painted everything in warm gold, the playground, the trees, the concentration on Jake's face as he pushed himself higher and higher. My grandson used to do that same thing with his tongue, the old man said suddenly. Garrett looked and saw that Jake was indeed sticking his tongue out slightly, the tip poking between his lips as he focused on coordinating his movements. Did he live around here? Garrett asked, though something in the man's tone suggested past tense for reasons that went beyond childhood. The old man was quiet for so long that Garrett wondered if he'd heard the question. Jake's swing created a rhythmic creaking that filled the space between them. He would have, the old man said finally. If things had been different, Garrett felt the weight of story in those words, the kind of story that lived in the spaces between what people said and what they couldn't say. He wanted to ask more, but Jake was calling out from the swing. Dad, take a picture. I'm so high. Garrett pulled out his phone, framing the shot as Jake reached the peak of his arc, his face bright with joy and accomplishment. Through the viewfinder, he could see the old man in the background, watching Jake with an expression of such tender attention that Garrett found himself stepping back to include both figures in the frame. He took the photo. Let me see, Jake called, slowing his swing with his feet. Garrett looked at the image on his phone screen. Jake was perfectly captured mid-swing, arms stretched out, hair wild, pure happiness radiating from every pixel. But it was the old man in the background that made the photo extraordinary, the way the afternoon light caught the side of his face, the gentle smile, the hands clasped in his lap. It looked like a painting, or a scene from a movie about the connections that happen in quiet moments when no one is really watching. That's a good one, Garrett said, showing Jake the screen. Jake studied the photo with the serious attention he gave to everything important. He looks nice, he said, glancing toward the bench. But the old man was gone. Garrett looked around the park, scanning the paths and the parking area, but saw no sign of him. It was as if he'd simply vanished, leaving only the memory of his presence and the lingering question of his story. Where did he go? Jake asked. I don't know, buddy. Maybe he had somewhere to be after all. They stayed at the park for another hour, Jake moving from the swings to the climbing structure to the small merry-go-round that squeaked with each revolution. Garrett kept glancing toward the empty bench, wondering about the grandson who would have lived around here if things had been different. On the drive home, Jake was quiet, staring out the window at the passing houses with their lit windows and families settling into evening routines. Dad? Yeah? Do you think that man was sad? Garrett considered the question, remembering the wistful expression, the careful way the old man had spoken about his grandson. Maybe a little. Sometimes grown-ups carry sad things, even when they're also happy. Like you? The words hit Garrett like a small, precise arrow. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Jake watching him with those enormous eyes that seemed to see everything. Yeah, buddy. Like me. But you're still my dad. I'm still your dad. And we still have good days. We still have good days. Jake nodded, satisfied with this accounting of their life, and went back to watching the world roll past the car window. That night, after dinner and bath time and the elaborate bedtime routine that included 3 stories and a detailed discussion of tomorrow's plans, Garrett sat in his small living room with his laptop open. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of Jake shifting in his sleep down the hall. He opened the photo he'd taken at the park, studying it more carefully now. There was something about the composition that drew him in the way Jake's joy seemed to radiate outward, touching even the stranger in the background. The old man's face was turned slightly toward Jake, and Garrett could see now what he'd only sensed in the moment, a look of recognition, as if he were seeing something or someone else entirely. Without really thinking about it, Garrett uploaded the photo to his social media account with a simple caption, "Good day at the park with this guy." He tagged it with the local hashtags he always used: Riverside Park, Single Dad, My Boy, and closed the laptop. He didn't expect anything to come of it. It was just a nice photo of a nice moment, the kind of thing people shared every day without consequence or complication. He had no way of knowing that in 3 days, that photo would be on the evening news. He had no way of knowing that the old man sitting quietly on the bench carried with him a story that had been waiting 47 years to be told. He had no way of knowing that sometimes the most ordinary moments are actually doors, waiting for exactly the right person to walk through them. Garrett turned off the lights and headed toward his bedroom, passing Jake's door where he could hear the soft, steady breathing of deep sleep. Tomorrow would bring another morning, another question from Jake, another ordinary day in their new life together. But tonight, in the space between sleeping and waking, the photo lived on the internet like a message in a bottle, floating through the vast ocean of shared moments and forgotten stories, waiting for the right eyes to find it. The phone call came at 7:23 a.m. on Friday morning, just as Garrett was trying to convince Jake that brushing teeth was not optional, even on days when they were running late. "Garrett Chen?" The voice was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. "Yes?" Garrett wedged the phone between his shoulder and ear, still holding Jake's backpack in one hand and a half-eaten piece of toast in the other. "This is Sarah Martinez from Channel 7 News. I'm calling about a photograph you posted earlier this week, the one from Riverside Park?" Garrett stopped moving. Jake looked up at him from the bathroom doorway, toothbrush hanging from his mouth like a small white flag of surrender. "I'm sorry, what?" "The photo of your son on the swing, with the elderly gentleman in the background. We'd like to talk to you about it, if possible. Would you have time to meet today?" Garrett felt that strange sensation of the ground shifting beneath his feet, the same feeling he'd had when Sarah, his ex-wife, had first mentioned wanting a separation. The feeling that ordinary life was about to become something else entirely. "I don't understand. It's just a picture of my kid at the park." "Sir, the elderly man in your photograph, we believe he might be someone we've been trying to locate for a very long time." Jake spit into the sink and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Dad? Who's on the phone?" Garrett held up one finger, his mind racing. "Locate? Is he missing?" "It's complicated. Could we meet? Maybe this afternoon? I know this must seem strange, but this photograph, it might be very important to a family that's been searching for answers for almost 50 years. The coffee shop Sarah Martinez had suggested was the kind of place that tried too hard to be casual. Exposed brick walls, mismatched furniture, chalkboard menus with aggressively whimsical font choices. Garrett arrived 10 minutes early and ordered a black coffee he didn't want, choosing a table in the back corner where he could see the door. He'd spent the day in a strange fog, going through the motions at work, while his mind kept circling back to the phone call. When his coworker Jenny had asked if he was feeling okay, he'd just said he was tired. Which wasn't entirely untrue. He'd been tired for months now, the bone-deep exhaustion that came from rebuilding a life from scratch while trying to make sure his 6-year-old son never felt the weight of that rebuilding. Sarah Martinez turned out to be younger than her voice had suggested, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and the kind of focused energy that Garrett associated with people who were very good at their jobs. She spotted him immediately, approaching with a confident stride and an extended hand. "Mr. Chen, thank you so much for meeting me." She sat down across from him, pulling out a tablet and a small notebook with practiced efficiency. "I have to admit, I'm still not sure why I'm here," Garrett said. "I understand this must feel surreal. Can I show you something?" She turned the tablet toward him. On the screen was his photograph from the park, but cropped and enhanced, focusing on the old man in the background. The image had been cleaned up, brightened, the details sharpened, until every line in the man's face was clearly visible. "Do you remember taking this?" "Of course. It was Tuesday afternoon." My son Jake was on the swings. What can you tell me about the man in the background? Garrett studied the enhanced image. In this version, he could see details he'd missed in the original, the careful way the man's cardigan was buttoned, the wedding ring on his left hand, the slight tilt of his head as he watched Jake swing. Not much. He was just sitting there when we arrived. He seemed nice. He mentioned having a grandson. Sarah made a note. Did he say anything else about his family? He said his grandson would have lived around here if things had been different. He talked about pushing him on swings like those. Garrett paused. Why? Who do you think he is? Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Garrett could see her choosing her words carefully. Have you ever heard of the Westwood Shopping Center incident? It was November 1977. Garrett shook his head. Before my time. A 3-year-old boy named David Morrison went missing from the shopping center while his mother was in the checkout line. One minute he was standing right next to her, the next he was gone. The case became one of the most publicized missing children cases in the city's history. Garrett felt something cold settle in his stomach. And you think? David would be 50 now. The same approximate age as the man in your photograph. Sarah pulled up another image on her table to digitally aged progression photo, showing what a 3-year-old boy might look like as a middle-aged man. The resemblance to the old man in Garrett's photo was unmistakable. But wait, Garrett said, studying the screen. That would make him 50, not 70. The man at the park was definitely older than 50. You're right. But we think the man in your photo might be Thomas Morrison, David's father. The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm, too close. Garrett loosened his tie, trying to process what Sarah was telling him. David's father disappeared 6 months after his son went missing. The investigation, the media attention, the not knowing it, destroyed his marriage, his career, everything. One day he just walked away from his life and was never seen again. That was January 1978. Garrett stared at the photograph on the tablet. The kind eyes, the patient way the man had watched Jake on the swings, the comment about his grandson. You think he's been living here all this time? We don't know. But your photograph is the first confirmed sighting we've had in 47 years. Sarah leaned forward. Mr. Chen, David Morrison's mother Thomas's ex-wife, she's still alive. She's never stopped looking for her son, and she's never stopped wondering what happened to her husband. This photograph. It might finally give her some answers. Garrett thought about Jake, about the fierce love that could drive a parent to impossible lengths, about the way loss could hollow out a person until they became someone else entirely. What do you need from me? We'd like to run the story tonight, with your permission, of course. Sometimes when these stories air, people come forward with information. Someone might know where he lives, where he goes. Someone might have seen him. And if you find him? Sarah's expression grew careful again. That's up to him. We're not trying to force anyone into anything. But Margaret Morrison, David's mother, she deserves to know that her husband might still be alive. And if Thomas is ready, maybe they both deserve the chance to finally have some peace. Garrett nodded slowly. It felt surreal, sitting in this aggressively casual coffee shop, discovering that his ordinary Tuesday afternoon had intersected with a story that had been unfolding for nearly 5 decades. There's one more thing, Sarah said. We'd like to interview you as well, about taking the photo, about meeting him. Would you be comfortable with that? Garrett thought about Jake, about their quiet life, about the careful privacy they'd built in the aftermath of the divorce. Going on television felt like opening a door he might not be able to close again. But he also thought about the old man's face as he watched Jake swing higher and higher, the wistful smile, the gentle way he'd spoken about pushing his grandson on swings just like those. Okay, he said. But I want to talk to my son first, explain what's happening. Of course. We're planning to air the story on the 10 o'clock news. That gives you time to prepare him. They shook hands again, and Sarah packed up her tablet with the same efficient movements she'd used to unpack it. Garrett watched her leave, then sat alone with his untouched coffee, staring at his phone where his original photo was still visible on his social media feed. 47 years. A lifetime of not knowing, of searching, of wondering if the people you loved were alive or dead or something in between. Garrett thought about his own small losses, the end of his marriage, the disruption of Jake's stable world, the way love could be present and absent at the same time. But those losses felt manageable compared to the story Sarah had just told him. He pulled out his phone and called his boss, explaining that he'd need to leave early. Family emergency, he said, which felt like the truth even though the family wasn't his own. Dad, are we going to be on TV? Jake was sitting cross-legged on his bed, still in his school clothes, looking simultaneously excited and worried in the way that only 6-year-olds could manage. Just me, buddy. You'll be in the picture they show, but you won't have to talk to anyone. Will the man from the park see it? Garrett sat down on the edge of Jake's bed, choosing his words carefully. He'd already explained about the missing boy, about how sometimes families got separated and couldn't find each other, about how their photograph might help someone who'd been looking for her family for a very long time. I hope so. That's kind of the point. Jake considered this, picking at the threads on his comforter with intense concentration. Is that why he looked sad? Because he lost his family? Maybe, we don't know for sure. But if the TV helps them find each other, then he won't be sad anymore? Garrett felt that familiar ache in his chest, the one that came whenever Jake's questions revealed how hard he was working to understand a world that didn't always make sense. It's complicated, Jake. Sometimes when people have been apart for a really long time, finding each other again can be happy and sad at the same time. Jake nodded seriously. Like when I visit Mom. I'm happy to see her, but sad that you're not there too. The words hit Garrett with unexpected force. In all the careful conversations about the divorce, all the reassurances that Jake was loved by both parents, all the scheduling and logistics of their new reality, this was the first time Jake had articulated the specific shape of his loss. Yeah, buddy, kind of like that. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, Jake continuing to pick at his comforter, Garrett trying to find the right balance between honesty and protection. Can I watch the news tonight? It'll be past your bedtime. But it's about us. Garrett looked at his son, really looked at him. 6 years old, caught between two homes, trying to make sense of a world where families could disappear and reappear, where photographs could become doorways to stories that had been waiting decades to be told. Okay, just this once, but you have to promise to go straight to sleep afterward. Jake grinned. That gap-toothed smile that never failed to remind Garrett of all the ordinary miracles that happened every day without fanfare or recognition. At 9:30, they made popcorn and settled on the couch together, Jake in his pajamas, Garrett still trying to process the strange turns the day had taken. The local news began with the usual mix of politics and weather, Garrett feeling increasingly nervous as the minutes ticked by. And then Sarah Martinez appeared on screen, standing in front of Riverside Park, holding a printed version of Garrett's photograph. Tonight, a local father's simple snapshot may have solved one of our area's oldest missing person cases. Garrett watched himself on television, answering Sarah's questions about that Tuesday afternoon, about the old man who had appeared and disappeared like something from a dream. The interview had been shorter than he'd expected, just a few minutes of questions about what he'd observed, what the man had said, how he'd seemed. But it was the other interview that made Garrett's breath catch in his throat. Margaret Morrison was 81 years old now, her hair silver white, her hands folded carefully in her lap as she sat in what appeared to be her living room. When Sarah showed her the enhanced photograph, her composure cracked just slightly, a quick intake of breath, a hand moving to cover her mouth. "That's him," she said quietly. "That's Thomas." She talked about the last 47 years, about never giving up hope that her son might be found, about the husband who had disappeared into his own grief until it swallowed him completely. "I always hoped he was alive somewhere," she said. "I hoped he'd found some kind of peace. But I also hoped that someday we might find our way back to each other, not to fix what was broken, you can't go back in time, but to not be strangers anymore." The story ended with Sarah asking viewers to call if they had any information about the man in the photograph, and then the weather report began. Bright and cheerful, and utterly ordinary. Jake had fallen asleep against Garrett's shoulder halfway through the broadcast, his breathing deep and even, his small body warm and trusting. Garrett sat in the blue glow of the television, holding his son, thinking about all the ways people could lose each other and all the unlikely ways they sometimes found their way back. His phone had been buzzing throughout the broadcast, notifications from social media, text messages from friends who had seen the story. But Garrett ignored them all, content to sit in the quiet with Jake sleeping against him, both of them safe in their small apartment, their own story continuing to unfold one ordinary day at a time. He had no way of knowing that 3 blocks away, in a small efficiency apartment above a used bookstore, Thomas Morrison was sitting in front of his own television, staring at a photograph of himself watching a little boy on a swing, finally understanding that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried forever. Sometimes it finds you in the most unexpected places, wearing the face of a 6-year-old boy who reminds you of another boy, in another time, when the world still held the possibility of perfect ordinary days that might never end. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on Saturday morning. Garrett jerked awake to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand, his heart immediately racing with that particular panic that comes when technology intrudes on sleep. Jake was still at his mother's house for the weekend, and the apartment felt too quiet, too empty in the gray pre-dawn light. "Mr. Chen?" The voice was unfamiliar, hesitant. "This is Detective Patricia Reeves with the City Police. I'm sorry to call so early, but we've had some developments regarding the story that aired last night." Garrett sat up, instantly alert. "Developments? We've had multiple calls to our tip line, people who recognize the man in your photograph. We believe we've located him." Garrett swung his legs over the side of the bed, bare feet finding the cold hardwood floor. "Is he okay?" "He's fine. But Mr. Chen, he's asking to speak with you." The police station smelled like burnt coffee and industrial disinfectant, with fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. Detective Reeves met Garrett in the lobby, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and the kind of steady presence that probably came from years of delivering difficult news to unprepared people. "He came in on his own this morning," she explained as they walked down a hallway, lined with bulletin boards and motivational posters that had seen better days. "Said he saw the news last night and thought it was time." "Time for what?" "To stop running, I think." She led him to a small conference room with a table, 4 chairs, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot. Thomas Morrison was sitting with his back to the door, wearing the same cardigan Garrett remembered from the park, his silver hair neatly combed, his hands folded on the table in front of him. He turned when they entered, and Garrett saw those same kind eyes, though they looked tired now, weighed down by something that might have been relief or regret or both. "Mr. Chen," Thomas said, standing and extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." His handshake was firm, steady. Up close, Garrett could see the small details that the photograph had missed: the careful way Thomas had shaved that morning, the slight tremor in his left hand, the wedding ring he still wore after all these years. Detective Reeves excused herself, saying she'd be right outside if they needed anything. Garrett sat down across from Thomas, feeling oddly like he was meeting a celebrity, someone he'd only known through stories and speculation, suddenly made flesh and blood. "I wanted to thank you," Thomas said quietly, "for the photograph, for treating me kindly that day at the park." "You don't need to thank me. I was just taking a picture of my son." "But you included me. You could have cropped me out or taken another shot without the strange old man in the background. But you didn't." Garrett studied Thomas's face, searching for signs of the man who had disappeared 47 years ago, the father who had lost everything and chosen to walk away rather than face what remained. "You weren't strange. You were just watching Jake swing. You looked." Garrett paused, trying to find the right words. "You looked like you remembered something good." Thomas's eyes filled with tears that he didn't try to hide. "I did. I remembered pushing David on swings just like those. He would have been about your son's age the last time we went to the park together. 3 years old, so proud when he could pump his legs by himself." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 47 years settling between them like dust. "Can I ask you something?" Garrett said finally. Thomas nodded. "Why now? Why come forward after all this time?" Thomas looked out the window at the parking lot, where ordinary people were going about their Saturday morning routines, loading groceries into cars, walking dogs, living lives that had never been interrupted by the kind of loss that could break a person completely. "I've been Thomas Mitchell for 47 years, he said. "Different name, different life. I worked construction, then maintenance, then bookkeeping for small businesses. I lived in a dozen different towns, always moving when things started to feel too settled, too real." He turned back to Garrett. "But watching your son on those swings, it was the first time in 47 years that I remembered who I used to be. Not the broken man who lost his child, not the husband who couldn't bear to look at his wife's grief because it mirrored his own. Just a father who loved watching his son discover how high he could fly." Garrett felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of the particular way love and loss could coexist in the same moment. "I thought about that day every night this week," Thomas continued. "Your son's laugh, the way he concentrated so hard on making the swing go higher. The way you watched him, protective but not afraid, proud but not pushy. It reminded me that being a father was the best thing I ever was, even if I wasn't allowed to be it for very long." "You could have been it again," Garrett said gently. "With another family." Thomas shook his head. "I tried. Once. Met a woman in Phoenix. Fell in love even. She had 2 daughters. But every time I looked at them, I saw David. Every laugh reminded me of his laugh. Every bedtime story reminded me of the stories I'd never get to finish. He was quiet for a long moment. I thought I was protecting them from my brokenness. But I was really just protecting myself from having to risk that kind of love again." Garrett thought about his own divorce, about the careful ways he and Sarah had divided their love for Jake, about the nights when he lay awake wondering if he was enough parent for one child, when he'd failed at being enough husband for one woman. "Do you regret it? Leaving?" "Every day. But I also don't know what else I could have done at the time. The investigation consumed everything. Margaret and we grieved in different ways. She needed to keep searching, keep hoping, keep David's memory alive. I needed the searching to stop. I needed the hoping to stop. I needed everything to just stop." Thomas pulled a small photograph from his wallet, creased and faded, showing a young woman holding a toddler with curly hair and Thomas's kind eyes. "This is the only picture I kept, David's 2nd birthday. We went to the zoo that day, and he was so excited about the elephants that he fell asleep in his stroller on the way home, elephant ears still on his head." Garrett looked at the photograph, seeing the ghost of the man he'd met at the park in the young father's face. "Margaret doesn't know I kept this. She doesn't know that I've thought about her every day for 47 years. She doesn't know that I've driven past her house a dozen times over the years just to make sure she was okay." "You know where she lives?" "I've always known. I never stopped loving her, Mr. Chen. I just stopped believing I deserved to be loved back." Detective Reeves knocked on the door, entering with 2 cups of coffee and the careful expression of someone who had witnessed many difficult reunions. "Mrs. Morrison is here," she said quietly. "She'd like to see you, if you're ready." Thomas went very still, his hands flat on the table. "Is she angry?" "I think she's many things," Detective Reeves said, "but mostly she seems relieved." Thomas looked at Garrett. "Will you stay? I know it's a strange thing to ask, but your photograph brought us to this moment. It feels right that you should see how the story ends." Garrett nodded, though he wasn't sure he belonged in such a private moment. But something about Thomas's quiet dignity, about the way he'd carried his grief for nearly 5 decades, made Garrett want to witness whatever came next. Detective Reeves left and returned a few minutes later with Margaret Morrison. She was smaller than she'd appeared on television, more fragile, but her eyes were sharp and clear as they took in the room, the table, the man sitting across from Garrett with his hands folded and his wedding ring catching the fluorescent light. "Hello, Thomas," she said. "Hello, Maggie." The use of her nickname seemed to break something loose in both of them. Margaret's composure cracked, and Thomas stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. They looked at each other across the small room, two people who had once shared everything, who had created a life together and watched it disappear in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Maggie." She crossed the room in 3 steps and put her arms around him, and Garrett saw Thomas collapse into her embrace, like a man who had been holding his breath for 47 years and could finally exhale. Garrett looked away, giving them what privacy he could in the small room, watching the parking lot where ordinary life continued to unfold without drama or revelation. When he looked back, they were sitting across from each other at the table, Margaret's hands covering Thomas's, both of them crying quietly. "I looked for you," she said. "For years I looked for you. I know, I'm sorry. I understood why you left. I didn't like it, but I understood it." Thomas lifted one hand to touch her face, his thumb brushing away a tear. "I never stopped loving you. I never stopped thinking about David. I just couldn't figure out how to live with both things at the same time." "And now?" Thomas looked at Garrett, then back at Margaret. "Now I think maybe love and grief don't have to be opposites. Maybe they can exist in the same space, the same heart, the same life." Margaret smiled through her tears. "It took you 47 years to figure that out?" "I was always a slow learner." She laughed then, a sound that seemed to surprise them both with its brightness. Garrett stood up quietly, feeling like an intruder on this moment of reunion and recognition. "I should go," he said. Thomas looked up. "Thank you, for everything. For including me in your photograph, for bringing us back to each other." "I didn't bring you back to anything," Garrett said. "You were already there, on that bench, watching my son swing. You just needed permission to remember who you used to be." He shook hands with both of them. These strangers who had become part of his story in ways he was still trying to understand. Walking out of the police station into the bright Saturday morning, Garrett felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense that the world was larger and more connected than he'd realized, that the small moments of ordinary life could ripple outward in ways that changed everything. He pulled out his phone and called Jake. "Hey buddy, how's your weekend with Mom?" "Good. We went to the Science Museum and I saw a real dinosaur skeleton." "Dad, did you know that T-Rex arms were actually really strong even though they looked small?" Garrett smiled, walking toward his car. "I didn't know that. Tell me more." As Jake launched into an excited explanation of dinosaur anatomy, Garrett thought about Thomas and Margaret, about the 47 years of separation that had ended in a small conference room with fluorescent lights and the smell of burnt coffee. Sometimes the most important stories began with the smallest moments. Sometimes a photograph was just a photograph, and sometimes it was a doorway back to everything you thought you'd lost forever. Sometimes love was patient enough to wait 47 years for the right moment to remember itself. 3 weeks later, Garrett found himself back at Riverside Park on a Tuesday afternoon, watching Jake arrange acorns in increasingly complex patterns beneath the old oak tree. The autumn light had shifted, grown thinner and more golden, and the playground equipment cast longer shadows across the worn grass. Jake had become obsessed with the acorn arrangement since hearing about the heart-shaped pattern they'd discovered that first day. Now he created elaborate designs, spirals and stars and geometric shapes that suggested an artistic sensibility Garrett hadn't known his son possessed. "Dad, look at this one," Jake called out, stepping back from his latest creation. "It's a maze. But there's only one way to get to the middle." Garrett walked over to examine the intricate pattern of acorns, each one placed with deliberate precision. "That's pretty impressive, buddy. What's in the middle?" "The best acorn, the one that would grow into the tallest tree." Garrett smiled, struck by his son's instinctive understanding that the most valuable things were often the hardest to reach. They'd been coming to the park every Tuesday since the reunion, as if keeping an appointment with something neither of them could quite name. Jake never asked about Thomas and Margaret directly, but Garrett had noticed the way his son's eyes searched the benches when they first arrived, the careful attention he paid to every elderly person who wandered through their afternoon routine. Today, that attention was rewarded. Thomas appeared at the edge of the playground, just as Jake was putting the finishing touches on his acorn maze, walking slowly with a woman Garrett recognized from the television interviews. Margaret moved with the careful deliberation of someone still learning to trust that good things might actually last, her hand resting lightly on Thomas's arm. Jake looked up from his creation and spotted them immediately. "Dad, it's them! It's the man from the swings and the lady from TV!" Garrett felt that familiar flutter of nervousness, the sensation of ordinary life being about to become something more significant, more complex. Thomas raised his hand in a small wave, and Garrett waved back, unsure of the etiquette for this situation. Were they friends now? Acquaintances? Fellow travelers in some story that none of them had chosen but all of them were somehow responsible for continuing? "Can I go say hi?" Jake asked. "Let them come to us, okay? Give them space to decide what they want." They watched as Thomas and Margaret approached slowly, their movements suggesting they were still negotiating the space between who they had been to each other and who they might become. "Mr. Chen," Thomas said when they reached the playground, "I hope you don't mind us interrupting." "Not at all. This is Jake. Jake, this is Mr. Thomas and Mrs. Margaret." Jake looked up at them with that direct, uncomplicated attention that 6-year-olds could manage, studying their faces with obvious curiosity. "Are you married again now?" he asked. Garrett felt his cheeks flush. "Jake, that's not really." "It's okay," Margaret said, smiling. "That's a very good question. We're figuring it out." "What does figuring it out mean?" Thomas knelt down so he was at Jake's eye level. "It means we're very old friends who haven't seen each other in a long time, and we're learning how to be friends again." Jake nodded seriously. "Like when me and Tommy Henderson had a fight about who got to be the Red Ranger, but then we decided we could take turns?" "Exactly like that," Margaret said, "except our fight lasted a little longer." "How much longer?" Thomas and Margaret exchanged a look. "About 47 years, Thomas said." Jake's eyes widened. "That's longer than my whole life times 7. "It is," Thomas agreed. "It's longer than a lot of things." Jake considered this mathematical reality, then seemed to accept it as just another fact about the adult world that didn't quite make sense, but didn't need to. "Do you want to see my acorn maze? It only has one way to get to the middle." Thomas and Margaret followed Jake to his creation, and Garrett watched as they crouched down to examine the intricate pattern with the same serious attention Jake had given to their story. "This is very sophisticated," Margaret said. "How did you know where to put each one?" "I just tried different ways until it felt right," Jake explained. "Dad says that's how you solve most problems." Garrett winced slightly, recognizing his own half-remembered advice being quoted back to him in front of people who had spent 47 years learning that some problems didn't have solutions, only different ways of carrying them. But Thomas was nodding. "Your dad is very wise. Sometimes you have to try a lot of different ways before you find the one that works." They spent the next hour at the playground, Jake moving between the swings and the climbing structure while the 3 adults sat on the bench where Thomas had first appeared in Garrett's photograph. The conversation was careful, polite, but underneath the surface pleasantries, Garrett could sense the deeper currents of 2 people learning to recognize each other again. "We wanted to thank you," Margaret said during a lull in Jake's chatter. "Both of you, for bringing us back together." "We didn't really do anything," Garrett said. "We were just here at the right time." "That's not nothing," Thomas said quietly. "Being in the right place at the right time, being open to connection when it appears, that's not as common as you might think." Garrett thought about his own life, about the way he'd been moving through his days since the divorce with his head down, focused on the immediate tasks of work and parenting and basic survival. He wondered how many connections he'd missed, how many opportunities for something larger had passed by while he was concentrated on just getting through. "Can I ask you something?" Garrett said. "What happens now? I mean with you two." Margaret and Thomas looked at each other with the particular intimacy of people who had learned to communicate in glances and small gestures. "We're taking it slowly," Margaret said. "We're different people than we were 47 years ago. We've had different lives, different losses, different ways of making sense of what happened to us. But we're not strangers, Thomas added. Even after all this time, even with everything that's changed, we're not strangers. Jake appeared at Garrett's elbow, slightly out of breath from his adventures on the climbing structure. Dad, can we come back next Tuesday? If you want to. I want to. And maybe Mr. Thomas and Mrs. Margaret can come too, and I can show them a new acorn pattern. Thomas smiled. I think we'd like that very much. As they prepared to leave, Jake ran back to his acorn maze one more time, carefully dismantling it and returning each acorn to the base of the oak tree. Why are you taking it apart? Margaret asked. So the squirrels can use them, Jake explained matter-of-factly, and so I can make a different one next time. Dad says the best things are the ones that don't last forever. Garrett blinked, not remembering having said exactly that, but recognizing the general philosophy he'd been trying to instill in Jake, the idea that impermanence didn't diminish beauty, that temporary connections could be just as meaningful as permanent ones. Your dad is very wise, Thomas said again, and this time Garrett heard something different in his voice, no just politeness, but genuine recognition. They walked toward the parking area together, Jake skipping ahead, the adults following more slowly. The late afternoon light painted everything in warm gold, and Garrett found himself trying to memorize the moment the way Margaret's hand rested on Thomas's arm, the sound of Jake's sneakers on the path, the particular quality of autumn light that made even ordinary moments feel touched with significance. Garrett, Thomas said as they reached their cars, I wonder if you'd be interested in having dinner sometime, you and Jake, just to continue the conversation. Garrett looked at Jake, who was climbing on the low stone wall that bordered the parking area, completely absorbed in the challenge of balancing on the narrow surface. I think we'd like that, he said. As they drove home, Jake was unusually quiet, staring out the window at the passing houses with their lit windows and families settling into evening routines. Dad? Yeah, buddy? Do you think Mr. Thomas and Mrs. Margaret will get married again? Garrett considered the question, thinking about the careful way they had moved around each other, the long looks, the hands that almost touched but didn't quite. I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe they'll find a different way to be important to each other. Like you and Mom? The question caught Garrett off guard. He and Sarah had been carefully cordial since the divorce, focused on Jake's well-being, but he wouldn't have described their relationship as important to each other in any meaningful way. What do you mean? You and Mom aren't married anymore, but you still care about each other because of me. It's a different way. Garrett felt that familiar ache in his chest, the one that came when Jake's observations revealed how much he saw, how much he understood about the careful reconstructions adults made of their lives. Yeah, buddy, it's a different way. Maybe there are lots of different ways to love people. Yeah, I think there are. That night, after Jake was asleep, Garrett sat in his small living room with his laptop open, scrolling through the dozens of messages he'd received since the story aired. Most were congratulatory, people who had been moved by the reunion, who wanted to share their own stories of loss and connection. But one message, received just that afternoon, made him pause. It was from a woman named Elena Vasquez, who had seen the news story and thought Garrett might be interested to know that there was a whole network of families who had lost children in the 1970s and 80s, before Amber Alerts and social media and all the systems that existed now to help find missing kids. Your photograph reminded us that these stories don't end, she had written. They just go underground for a while, waiting for the right moment to surface. There are dozens of families like the Morrisons, still waiting for their own moment of recognition. She had included a website, a database of long-term missing persons cases, photographs of children who had disappeared decades ago, digitally aged to show what they might look like now. Garrett scrolled through the Faces page after page of missing children who would now be adults, living unknown lives or no lives at all. Each photograph was accompanied by a story, a date, a description of the last time they were seen. The scale of it was overwhelming. All these families, all these years of not knowing, of searching, of hoping and grieving, and continuing to love children who might not even remember their original names. Garrett closed the laptop, feeling the weight of all those unfinished stories, all those photographs that hadn't yet found their way to the right eyes at the right moment. But he also felt something else, a sense of possibility. If one photograph could bridge 47 years, if one ordinary moment could become a doorway back to everything that had been lost, then maybe there were other doorways waiting to be opened. Maybe the most important thing was simply to keep paying attention, to keep being present in those small moments when connection became possible. Maybe the act of really seeing the people who crossed your path was itself a form of love, a way of saying that every story mattered, that no one was truly invisible, that even the briefest encounter could ripple outward in ways that changed everything. Garrett turned off the lights and headed toward his bedroom, passing Jake's door where he could hear the soft, steady breathing of deep sleep. Tomorrow would bring another morning, another ordinary day in their new life together. But tonight, in the space between sleeping and waking, Garrett carried with him the image of Thomas and Margaret learning to recognize each other again, of Jake's acorn maze with its single path to the center, of all the ways that love could persist even when everything else fell apart. Sometimes the most important stories were the ones that took 47 years to tell. Sometimes the ending was really just another beginning, disguised as closure. Sometimes the photograph was just the first word in a conversation that would continue long after the camera was put away.